This is part 3 of our video series learning how to make a realistic water gun using a dial caliper. In this video, we are going to learn to make this trigger piece right here. So the first thing you need to notice is that where the trigger is located, it's inside the cylinder on this stopper piece. If we grab our whole piece, you'll see the stopper inside this cylinder. The trigger inserts and presses against it. And so with that in mind, let's start a sketch on this interface here that the trigger will be attached to. And so I'll start a sketch, and then the first thing I'm going to do is actually turn off both my cylinder and my stopper, make them invisible, and I'm just going to draw a circle on the origin. Now, the question is how big is this circle that inserts into the stopper? And it looks like it's almost 0.2 exactly. And so we can just make it 0.195. Dimension it to be 0.195 in diameter. And then I'll finish my sketch, and then it extrudes to what? Well, how far does it extrude from? I'll probably make it full screen. It extrudes forward 0.68, 0.675. We'll just call it 0.68. 0.68 inches forward. All right. Now, you'll notice that there's a rectangle and a little T on top. There's also this little arc here, but what I notice is actually the arc is sort of extruded in front of this rectangle, but the T is as wide as the rectangle. If you look at, there's little lines separating the arc from the rectangle, and it's as thick as the T. And so I'm going to use that to my advantage here. Let's start with sketching the rectangle. So I'm going to grab a rectangle and go here. Now I know I want the rectangle centered, and so we're going to go ahead and go to create point right here. I want it centered left and right. So I'm going to grab my horizontal vertical constraint and select this point and the origin. I don't think it's going to be centered up and down, and we can figure that out. But let's start with, well, how wide and how tall is our rectangle here? Well, the rectangle is, what, 0.3 wide and 0.42 tall? Okay. 0.3 wide and 0.42 tall. And if I look at this, it actually looks kind of disproportional. Let's look at that again. It looks a little bit taller than it is wide proportionally from here. So if I measure the height again, what do I get? I get 0.52. There's the problem. All right, I saw 0.42, 0.52, and that looks better. And so the question is how high up and down does it go? Well, I can figure that out pretty easy actually by lining up the back and then pushing down until the back hits that edge, and then I can just read that number. It looks like it's about 0.135. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab a point tool, and I'm going to put it at the bottom here, because I'm not measuring to the center, I'm measuring to the bottom edge here. And I'm going to go ahead and hit dimension from here to here and tell that to be 0.135. And that didn't fully constrain it. Why didn't that fully constrain it? I'm going to grab it and drag it and see what, oh, because the point is not centered. That's an easy fix. I'm going to go ahead and grab my horizontal vertical constraint and select this point and this point, and there we go. Now it's fully constrained. Now I know there's a T on top as well. And so let's start with this bottom part of that T right here. How wide is this? Looks like it's 0.1 almost exactly wide. And how tall does it go? So we'll go ahead and insert these this top measurement part and drag that out. It looks like it's almost exactly 0.08 wide. So I'll grab my rectangle tool, I'll connect it. I'm going to tell it to be 0.1 wide and 0.08 tall. And if we look at it now, it's not centered. And to center it, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to drag it out to the right, and I'm going to grab my point tool, and I'm going to select the bottom center here, and I'm going to tell those 2 points to be coincident. And okay. All right, and then all we got left is the top rectangle here. How wide is this? It's 0.215 wide, and how tall is it? 0.075 or 0.08 tall. So we'll grab one more rectangle tool, and this time I'm going to just draw it on the outside. And I'm going to grab my point tool from the beginning. I'm going to find the center here and the center here. I'm going to tell those two to be coincident so that it's perfectly centered. And then I'll add my dimensions. I want it to be, I already forgot how wide it was. .215 wide and 0.075 tall. And I'm going to hit finish sketch. And then how far does it extrude? Well, once again, I'm only going to measure the T, and then I'll add this little arc after the fact. So how wide is the T? 0.075 wide. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and extrude this, all of it, to be 0.075. Now I'm going to go ahead and add that arc by sketching on this face. And I'm going to grab my line tool. I'm going to drag this out. I'm going to hit escape on my keyboard. And I'm going to grab my line tool again and draw another one on the bottom. Make sure they're both horizontal. And I'm going to tell them both to be equal. So that way, as I drag one out, the other one drags out as well. And I'm going to connect these two with my arc tool. Now, how wide is this arc? It is almost exactly 1.4 wide. And so I'm going to be very careful not to measure to this front edge, but to the back edge, since that's what I just measured. And I'm going to tell that to be 0.14. And then how wide is the arc? We can actually figure that out too. If we just measure it at its thinnest point. Looks like it's almost exactly 0.1. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab a point tool and find the center. And I'll dimension that point to this back edge as well and tell that to be 0.1. And there we go. We've got this fully dimensioned arc. I'm going to finish my sketch. And I'm going to extrude this to the back edge. And okay. Now, this next part that I want to do is kind of hard to actually exactly measure. It's kind of have to be something that we eyeball. But if you notice, there's a little indentation so that your finger just sort of naturally fits into it. So how do we do that? Well, again, I can't do it exactly, but I can kind of do something that sort of mimics the effect here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start a sketch on this mid plane right here. And I want to first hit P on this keyboard and project this arc and hit OK. Now what I want to do is I want to draw a rectangle through the middle. Now I want to, let's actually grab my line tool. I'm going to turn on construction lines. I'm going to connect this to this point and this end to this point. I'm going to go ahead and tell these lines to be vertical. And I want to also tell these two lines to be equal. And so what that does is it allows me to drag it up and down. And so what am I doing? Well, I'm going to keep my construction lines turned on and draw one more vertical line. If I finish my sketch, you can see what I want to do. I'm going to go back in a second to edit the dimensions a little bit. But I want to revolve these two profiles around this axis. And hopefully you can kind of see what I'm going for here. Now, I don't want it to quite be this big. And so I can play with my dimensions a little bit. So I can dimension this to be, let's say 0.3 at first. And I can manipulate these dimensions. So these are kind of placeholder dimensions. But how wide is this? Right now it's 0.54. Let's play with 0.5. I'm sorry, 0.05. And how far from the bottom will this be? Let's start with 0.03. And I'm going to go ahead and look at that revolution again and see how it looks. And maybe I want it to not be quite so wide. So we go back in here. Maybe I'll tell this to be 0.2, bringing this axis a little bit closer. What does that do? And that doesn't look bad at all. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, what's the point of that? That doesn't look that smooth. And you're right, but I'm also going to add a fillet here to these edges and see how that looks. And that doesn't look bad at all. And hit OK. And so you kind of play with the measurements to make yours look right. Maybe I'll make this 0.02 and see what that does. Now that screwed up the fillet, so maybe I'll make the fillet a little less tall. But maybe I liked it at 0.03. And so you play with all the dimensions until you get it to look the way you want it to. Finish my sketch and... But yeah, you go ahead, I mean, you can play with all the dimensions and the fillets until you get it the way you want it. But I think this looks pretty good as is. My finger would fit in there nicely. Hit OK. Hopefully you get the idea here. It's not exactly something we can perfectly measure. And the way you would actually do it is you would play with it, you'd print it out, or you'd make the part, and then you'd feel how it felt. And then you would adjust the measurements and adjust the way you did it until it fit into your finger nicely. But there's one more little part on here that we need, and it's this hole here in the back. And so, well, it looks like it's just a shell. So let's see if we can just shell it out. It looks like it's about 0.065 wide. Okay, and so if I grab my shell tool and I tell it to be 0.065, it looks like it's having an error. That's weird, but that's okay because it's just making this part hollow, not this part, I think. And so I'm just going to start a sketch here and just do it the old-fashioned way. I'm going to draw a circle, and let's just actually just dimension from here to here to be 0.065, and then finish my sketch, and I'll just extrude this to this wall, and it does the same thing. Okay. All right. And so what else do we need for this? Well, we need to color the trigger. So I'm going to hit A on my keyboard for appearance. And I want it to be another plastic. And so I'm going to duplicate my previous plastic. I'm going to drag it on, but I'm going to change the color to a yellowish color. And then I'm not quite done because, well, I want to turn these other two pieces on. And it looks like I never, when I made my trigger, when I extruded it, I didn't make it its own component. So let's go ahead and do that now. I'm going to create components from bodies, from this body 3. And then now that it's a component, I'm going to go ahead and call it trigger. And what do I want? Well, I want this to be attached to my stopper. So let's turn the cylinder off. I'm going to grab my, what's called my as-built joint. And so that's Shift-J on your keyboard if you want a quick command, but I want to grab my as-built joint and I want to select these two, and I want them to be rigid together. So as one move, so does the other. I'm going to go ahead and revert the position. I'll turn the cylinder back on, and then I'm going to grab my as-built joint again. I'm going to select my trigger and my cylinder, and I want this to slide. In which direction? Well, I'll just select this axis right here. So it slides back and forth. And I want it to have a minimum and a maximum. So what happens if I turn these on and I say, I don't know, 0.3? And I don't think I want it to go that way. So let's make the minimum negative 0.3. And that's actually almost perfect. And then what's the maximum going to be? Well, I want the maximum to stay at 0, right? We can go ahead and animate that motion. And it looks perfect. Hit OK. And so if I turn my cylinder back off, you can see it slides back and forth and it pushes the stopper with it. And I think that's a good place to stop this video. I'm going to make sure I hit save and hit OK.